What happens when a high-profile guest completely loses control during a live television interview, forcing the host to make an unprecedented decision that shocks millions of viewers? You're about to witness one of the most jaw-dropping moments in morning television history. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below because this story will leave you speechless. Michael Strahan had been hosting Good Morning America for years and he thought he had seen it all. Difficult guests, awkward moments, technical difficulties, you name it. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold on this particular morning. The show's producers had been thrilled to book Meghan Markle for an exclusive interview segment. It was supposed to be a routine promotional appearance, the kind that fills time slots and generates social media buzz. As Michael reviewed his notes in the makeup chair, everything seemed normal. The usual pre-show energy buzzed through the studio as crew members adjusted lighting and tested microphone. Meghan had arrived on time, went through hair and makeup without incident, and even exchanged pleasantries with several staff members. Her publicist had provided the standard list of approved topics. Nothing seemed off-limits or particularly controversial. 5 minutes to air, called out the floor director, and Michael made his way to the interview area. The set was arranged with 2 comfortable chairs positioned at a slight angle, allowing for natural conversation while keeping both guests visible to the cameras. Fresh flowers adorned the small table between them, and the morning light streaming through the studio windows created the perfect ambience for what should have been a pleasant interview. Meghan took her seat, adjusting her outfit and checking her appearance in the monitor. She smiled warmly at Michael as the sound technician clipped a microphone to her lapel. Everything appeared to be going according to plan. The countdown began and Michael slipped into his professional mode, the same confident demeanor that had made him a beloved television personality. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Strahan and we're here with a very special guest today." He began, flashing his signature smile to the cameras. "Joining us now is Meghan Markle, and we're excited to talk with her about her latest projects and initiatives." "Meghan, thank you so much for being here with us this morning." "Thank you for having me, Michael." Meghan responded, her voice carrying that familiar, polished tone that viewers had come to know. "I'm delighted to be here." The first few minutes proceeded exactly as planned. Michael asked about her recent charitable work, her upcoming projects, and her thoughts on various social issues. Meghan's responses were articulate and measured, hitting all that expected talking points. The interview was flowing smoothly and everyone in the studio felt relaxed. The producers behind the cameras nodded approvingly, pleased that everything was going according to script. But then something shifted. Michael, following his prepared questions, asked what seemed like an innocuous follow-up about her experience working with different media outlets and how she approaches various interviews differently. While Meghan began, her tone suddenly taking on a sharper edge. "I think it's important to acknowledge that not all interviews are created equal, and frankly not all interviewers are capable of handling certain conversations with the nuance they require." Michael's eyebrows raised slightly, but he maintained his professional composure. This wasn't entirely unexpected. Many guests made subtle critiques of media coverage during interviews. He decided to probe a bit further, thinking this might lead to an interesting discussion about media literacy. "That's an interesting perspective. Meghan, can you elaborate on what you mean by that? What makes for a more effective interview dynamic in your experience?" Instead of the thoughtful response Michael was expecting, Meghan's expression hardened noticeably. She leaned forward in her chair, her voice dropping to a more serious register that immediately changed the atmosphere in the studio. "What I mean, Michael, is that there are interviewers who understand complex issues, and then there are those who are better suited for, shall we say, sports-demanding content. For instance, requires a very different skill set than discussing matters of real social importance." The comment hung in the air for a moment, and Michael felt the energy in the room shift dramatically. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged concerned glances. This was clearly heading in an unplanned direction and not a positive one. Michael, however, had years of experience handling unexpected moments on live television. He chose to address the comment directly but diplomatically. "I appreciate that perspective, Meghan, though I'd say that many of us in broadcasting have had the opportunity to cover a wide range of topics throughout our careers. The beauty of this format is that we get to explore different subjects and learn from our guests' expertise." But instead of backing down or redirecting the conversation, Meghan doubled down on her criticism, her voice becoming more pointed and aggressive. "That's exactly what I'm talking about, Michael. This tendency to oversimplify complex issues, to treat everything as if it's all the same level of importance. When someone, like myself, comes on a show to discuss serious matters, real issues that affect people's lives, I expect to be speaking with someone who understands the gravity of these topics, not someone whose primary experience is discussing batting averages and touchdown passes." Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his professional training kicked in. He had dealt with difficult guests before, but never someone who had so blatantly insulted his background and capabilities. On live television, the camera operators continued filming, unsure whether they should cut away or keep rolling. The entire studio fell silent except for the low hum of equipment and the sound of Meghan's increasingly aggressive tone. "Meghan, I think there might be some misunderstanding here," Michael replied, his voice remaining steady despite the obvious provocation. "We invited you here today to have a respectful conversation about your work and initiatives. I'm not sure where this hostility is coming from, but perhaps we could refocus on the topics you'd like to discuss." Instead of apologizing or acknowledging that she had crossed a line, Meghan seemed to interpret Michael's diplomatic response as weakness. She sat back in her chair with a dismissive gesture, shaking her head as if disappointed by his reaction. "This is exactly what I mean, Michael. This inability to engage with challenging ideas, this immediate retreat to safe, superficial topics when a conversation starts to get real, it's precisely this kind of intellectual timidity that makes certain media personalities unsuitable for serious discourse." The insult was now unmistakable, and everyone in the studio could feel the tension reaching a breaking point. Michael's co-hosts, watching from their positions at the main desk, looked stunned. The floor director was frantically trying to get the attention of the control room, unsure whether they should cut to commercial or let the disaster continue to unfold on live television. Michael took a deep breath, his years of professionalism wearing with his natural, human reaction to being so publicly disrespected. He had built his career on being gracious, accommodating, and finding ways to make even the most challenging interviews work. But this was unlike anything he had ever encountered, and he could see that continuing to take the diplomatic approach was only encouraging more aggressive behavior. "Meghan, I'm going to stop you right there," Michael said, his voice taking on a firmer tone while still maintaining his composure. "I've been nothing but respectful to you since you walked into this studio, and I extended an invitation for you to share your message with our viewers. What you're doing right now is not only unprofessional, but it's also disrespectful to everyone who works on this show and to the people watching at home." For a moment it seemed like Michael's direct response might bring some sanity back to the conversation. But instead of recognizing that she had gone too far, Meghan appeared to become even more agitated by his pushback. She shifted in her chair, her body language becoming more confrontational as she prepared to escalate the situation further. "Disrespectful?" Meghan repeated, her voice rising slightly. "What's disrespectful? Michael is pretending that all opinions and all expertise are equally valuable. What's disrespectful is putting someone like me, who has actually lived through significant experiences and has real insights to share, in a position where I have to pretend that surface-level questions and superficial commentary constitute meaningful journalism." Michael felt his patience wearing thin, but he made one more attempt to salvage the interview and maintain some semblance of professionalism for the sake of the viewers and his colleagues. "Meghan, if you have specific topics you'd like to discuss, or if there are particular questions you think would be more valuable, I'm happy to pivot this conversation in that direction. But what I won't do is sit here and allow you to continue insulting me, my background, or the work that everyone here does every day." The reasonable offer seemed to only fuel Meghan's determination to continue her attack. She leaned forward again, her eyes narrowing as she prepared to deliver what would prove to be the final straw in this increasingly uncomfortable exchange. "You see, this is exactly the problem with people in your position, Michael. You think that offering to change the subject somehow addresses the fundamental issue here, which is competence. You can't simply pivot away from the fact that you're out of your depth when it comes to discussing matters of real substance. This isn't about different topics. It's about different levels of intellectual capacity." The studio fell completely silent. Even the usual background noise of cameras and equipment seemed to fade away as everyone present processed what had just been said on live television. Michael's expression shifted from diplomatic patience to barely contained anger, and for the first time since the interview began, his professional mask slipped slightly. "Are you seriously questioning my intellectual capacity on live television?" Michael asked, his voice low but filled with controlled intensity. "Are you actually sitting in my house as a guest on my show, suggesting that I'm intellectually inferior to you?" Instead of recognizing the dangerous territory she had entered, Meghan seemed emboldened by Michael's obvious anger. She sat back with what could only be described as a smug expression, clearly believing she had gained some kind of upper hand in the exchange. "I'm not suggesting anything, Michael. I'm stating clearly that there are people who are equipped to handle complex, nuanced discussions about important issues, and there are people who are better suited to lighter fare. There's nothing wrong with knowing your limitations, but there is something wrong with pretending those limitations don't exist." Michael stared at her for a long moment, and everyone watching could see him making a decision. His jaw was tight, his hands gripped the arms of his chair, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight and authority that commanded attention from everyone in the studio. "Let me tell you something, Meghan, and I want you to listen very carefully because this is important. I've been in broadcasting for over 2 decades. I've covered everything from natural disasters to political elections, from human interest stories to breaking news that changed the world. I've interviewed presidents, Nobel Prize winners, activists, artists, and yes, athletes too. Because guess what? They're human beings with stories worth telling." Meghan tried to interrupt, but Michael held up his hand and continued, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each word. "You walked into the studio as my guest, and I treated you with nothing but respect and professionalism. I prepared thoughtful questions. I gave you a platform to share your message, and I've been patient even as you spent the last several minutes insulting not just me but everyone who works here. And now you have the audacity to question my intellectual capacity." The control room was buzzing with activity as producers tried to decide how to handle the situation. Some argued for cutting to commercial immediately, while others insisted they needed to let Michael finish his response. The decision was ultimately made to keep rolling, partly because they were witnessing television history in the making and partly because cutting away now might make the situation even worse. Michael stood up from his chair, towering over Meghan, who suddenly looked much smaller and less confident than she had moments before. His movement was deliberate and controlled, and when he spoke again, every word carried the weight of his years of experience and his genuine anger at the situation. "I've had enough of this, Meghan. This interview is over, not because I can't handle difficult conversations or challenging topics, but because I refuse to provide a platform for someone who thinks that being disrespectful and insulting constitutes intelligent discourse. You're done here." For the first time since the interview began, Meghan looked genuinely surprised. She glanced around the studio as if suddenly realizing that her behavior might have consequences. And when she looked back at Michael, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "You can't just end an interview because you don't like what I'm saying," she protested. But her voice lacked the confident aggression it had carried throughout the previous exchange. "This is supposed to be a professional conversation." Michael's response was swift and definitive, delivered with the kind of authority that made it clear he was completely serious about what he was saying. "You're absolutely right, Meghan. This was supposed to be a professional conversation. But you decided to make it something else entirely. You turned this into a personal attack. You insulted my intelligence, my background, and my capabilities, all while sitting as a guest on my show. That's not professional discourse. That's just being cruel and arrogant." The tension in the studio had reached a fever pitch, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something unprecedented in morning television history. Meghan's composure finally began to crack as the reality of the situation set in. She looked around the studio, perhaps hoping to find support from the crew or producers, but every face she encountered reflected the same mixture of shock and disapproval. The confident, almost arrogant demeanor she had maintained throughout the interview was rapidly dissolving into something closer to panic. "Michael, I think you're overreacting," she said, her voice now carrying a note of desperation that was impossible to miss. "We're having a spirited discussion about important issues. Isn't that what good television is supposed to be about? Challenging conversations that push boundaries." Michael shook his head, his expression remaining stern and unwavering. He had clearly reached his limit, and there was no going back from this point. When his words were measured, but filled with unmistakable finality. "No, Meghan, that's not what this was. A spirited discussion involves mutual respect and good faith engagement with ideas. What you did was launch personal attacks disguised as intellectual superiority. You didn't challenge my ideas or my questions. You attacked my character and my competence. There's a world of difference between those two things." Meghan made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative, but her efforts only served to highlight how completely she had misread the situation and her audience. "I was simply trying to elevate the conversation beyond superficial pleasantries," she insisted, but even as she spoke, she seemed to realize how hollow her justification sounded. Sometimes real progress requires uncomfortable honesty about the limitations we all face in different areas. Michael's response was swift and devastating in its clarity. He had found his voice again, and when he spoke, it was with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he stood and why he was right. "Uncomfortable honesty, is that what you call it when you suggest that my background in sports makes me intellectually unfit to interview you? Is that your version of elevating the conversation, telling me that I lack the capacity for meaningful journalism? Because from where I'm standing, that sounds less like uncomfortable honesty and more like simple arrogance and disrespect." The studio would become completely silent except for the sound of their voices. Camera operators continued to film, knowing instinctively that they were capturing something that would be talked about for years to come. Behind the cameras, producers were frantically trying to figure out how to handle the unprecedented situation unfolding on live television. Meghan made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of the interview, her voice taking on a pleading quality that was a stark contrast to the aggressive confidence she had displayed earlier. "Michael, please. I think we're both getting a bit heated here. Maybe we should take a step back and try to find some common ground. I certainly didn't mean to offend you personally. Perhaps I could have phrased some of my observations more diplomatically," but Michael was far beyond the point where diplomatic language could repair the damage that had been done. He looked at her with an expression that mixed disappointment with firm resolve, and when he spoke, every word carried the weight of his decision. "Meghan, the time for diplomatic language was when you first sat down in that chair. The time for finding common ground was when I welcomed you to the show and gave you every opportunity to share your message respectfully. You chose a different path. You make this personal. You chose to be insulting. And you chose to treat this platform and everyone associated with it with contempt." He paused for a moment, looking directly into the camera as if speaking to the viewers at home, before turning his attention back to his guest. "I've been doing this job long enough to know the difference between a challenging conversation and a personal attack. I've interviewed people I disagreed with, people who had strong opinions, people who pushed back on my questions, and I've always found ways to make those interviews work because they were conducted with mutual respect. What happened here today was not that." Meghan opened her mouth as if to respond, but Michael continued before she could speak, his voice growing stronger and more authoritative with each sentence. You questioned my intellectual capacity. You dismissed my professional experience. You suggested that I was unfit to conduct this interview, and you did all of this while sitting as a guest on my show using my platform, speaking to my audience. That's not challenging discourse. That's just bad behavior, and I won't tolerate it. The finality in his voice made it clear that the conversation was over, but Meghan seemed unable to accept that reality. She remained seated, looking around the studio as if hoping someone would intervene on her behalf or offer her a way to continue the interview. So what happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You're just going to cut this short because you didn't like my tone. Michael's response was immediate and uncompromising, delivered with the kind of authority that left no room for negotiation or further discussion. What happens now is that you leave. This interview is over, this segment is done, and you need to gather your things and go. I've given you more chances than you deserve to conduct yourself professionally, and you've chosen not to take any of them. I'm not going to provide you with another opportunity to insult me or anyone else who works here. For a moment, Meghan sat in stunned silence, apparently unable to process that she was actually being asked to leave. When she finally stood up from her chair, her movements were uncertain and awkward, a far cry from the confident woman who had entered the studio less than an hour earlier. This is unprecedented, she said, her voice carrying a mixture of shock and indignation. I've never been treated this way during an interview. Michael's final response was delivered with calm certainty, the words of someone who was completely comfortable with the decision he had made and the reasons behind it. Maybe that's because you've never behaved this way during an interview before. Or maybe other hosts were willing to tolerate disrespectful behavior that I'm not willing to accept. Either way, this conversation is finished. As Meghan gathered her belongings and made her way toward the exit, followed discreetly by security personnel, Michael turned to face the camera directly. His expression had softened slightly, but his voice still carried the weight of everything that had just transpired. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue with the rest of today's show. Sometimes in live television, things don't go according to plan, but we always try to maintain the standards of respect and professionalism that you deserve as our viewers. The camera held on his face for a moment longer, capturing the mixture of resolve and disappointment that reflected the extraordinary circumstances of what had just occurred. As the show cut to commercial, the studio remained silent, everyone still processing the unprecedented events they had just witnessed. What did you think of Michael Strahan's handling of this impossible situation? Was he right to end the interview, or should he have found another way to manage his difficult guest? Subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments below what you would have done if you were in his position.